just want to say my welcome before Dave really starts to begin our presentations with you. So welcome. I'm so glad you're here. This is one of the things that the Wild Center has done since the beginning, and we want to continue to do, is convene the community for issues of importance to the community or smaller parts of the community. So this is what we want to do. We love that you're here. We love that we can host this meeting. We'd like to host more meetings. This is a beautiful building built by the community, and we really want the space used as much as possible. So we're thrilled to be able to offer this place for you all to convene. So welcome on behalf of the Wild Center. And we're going to start. I'm going to turn it over to Dave to start, and we're going to sort of do a tag team today in our presentation, and Dave is going to start for us.
Hello, everyone. We're in Mohawk. We say "Sayag Skanok Go." That just is a greeting, and "Skanok Go" just means peace for all of us. My name is Dave Fadden, but my real name, my first name, is Kanietakeron. And Kanietakeron is a Mohawk name that translates into English to mean patches of snow. So I was born March 15th. Beware the Ides of March. That's when I was born. And during that time of the year, the snow starts to melt and you have patches of snow on the ground. And it was my great-grandmother. I don't remember her, but she was still alive. And she's from Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk territory right along the St. Lawrence River. And when I was born, it was a thaw, and there was patches of snow on the ground, and that became my name. And I often wondered why I got that name, because I was born in Lake Placid, and I was raised in Anchayota. And if you're not familiar with Anchayota, it's if you blink, you've gone past it. It's out in the middle of the woods, and that's where I was raised. But I often wondered why I got that name, because mid-March, we still have about 10 foot of snow. We don't have patches of snow. But I moved to Haudenosaunee in the early 90s. And my first birthday, there was patches of snow on March 15th. I'm a wolf clan, and a clan is your extended family. And you get your clan and your identity through your mom. We're a matrilineal society among the Haudenosaunee, or also known as the Iroquois or the Six Nations, of which Mohawk is one of six. Your clan is your extended family, and your name is your personal identity, and your citizenship also goes through your mother. And because my mother's a Mohawk, I'm a Mohawk. I'm part Scottish. I think there's some French in there. I don't tell too many people, but there's a little French in there. But politically and according to our way, I'm a Mohawk. I could go on and on talking about my culture, but we were talking to Stephanie about how we're going to try to cram all of this into about 90 minutes. And so I'm going to have to skip through a lot. And anytime I have a captivated audience, I just want to tell them everything I know. But as you see on the screen, there's a wampum belt. And wampum is a bead that is made from the quahog shell. And wampum, contrary to popular belief, isn't money. It isn't currency. Indigenous people in the Haudenosaunee, we didn't have money. And as a result, we also didn't have poverty. Nobody went hungry unless everyone did. Theft was unheard of. Stealing was unheard of. We learned that from Europe. That was brought here. Wampum was used by our people and put on a loom with sinew strings in different designs, the natural color of the shell, different patterns, and they would use to remember really important events in our history, whether it be a treaty with another group of people, maybe it's a very important story. They would design a wampum belt to commemorate that particular event or that agreement with other people. Among the Haudenosaunee, whenever there was an agreement made, a treaty with another group, they say it isn't official until wampum is exchanged. That almost seals the deal. Now, this particular wampum belt is called a two-row, or in Mohawk they call it kaswenta. And the symbolism behind it is very simple. And you have two rows of dark purple going down. Those two rows represent two people. One row represents the Haudenosaunee in our canoe, going down, paddling down the river of life. Everything in that canoe is everything about us. Our language, our customs, our clans, our spiritual beliefs, our laws, everything is contained within that canoe. Paddling down the river of life. And next to us, it started with the Dutch. And eventually ended up the English, the French, and ultimately the Americans. In their ship, and everything about them is within that ship. Their laws, their customs, their beliefs, and their ways. Those two vessels paddle and sail down the river of life, never to interfere with each other. But between them, the white is a symbol of peace and friendship. They never try to steer the other vessel. They never put a foot in the other boat. They simply go as friends throughout life. And this is a treaty that we hold on to even to this very day. We're still in our canoe. In fact, in 1924, the United States government offered the Haudenosaunee and all indigenous people American citizenship. Some people accepted it, but our Grand Council at Onondaga had a meeting what to do about this. We wrote a letter back to the United States and says, thank you so much, but we have to decline. Because we have our own identity, and we never gave it up. We have our own political structure. We have our own chiefs that are put into power by the women of the clans. We have a council of 50 chiefs. In Mohawk, they say loyane, or good men, that sit in council to settle disputes. Our clan system, our names, everything. We have it, we're not giving that up. But thanks. We'll remain as friends. And so we hold on to that concept today. And it also symbolizes mutual aid. So if, like, the United States needs help, they can come to us and we'll offer our assistance like a friend would. These wars that occurred in this country, every single war the Haudenosaunee have participated in. Even during World War II, Hitler going across Europe, it was scary. The Haudenosaunee declared war on Germany and sided with the Americans and went across the ocean to fight. But if we need help, the United States is supposed to honor that treaty and to help us as a friend would. So we hold on to that concept. And so when we go through life as friends, things pop up now and again. Some things bad, some things good. And I met Stephanie, I can't remember what year, 2015, 16. She stopped by our museum in Achayota. We had a very nice discussion. And we started talking about museum work and the Wild Center. And the idea popped up about perhaps redesigning a part of this facility, an exhibit, from a Native perspective. And I got excited. You know, it's our little place in Achayota. I know some of you may have been there. It's a little place. It's only 4 rooms. I'll get into it later. And our reach isn't that big. We get about 2,000 people a summer. But here at the Wild Center, the numbers are huge. And so this was an opportunity for us as educators to reach a wider audience. And so we had meetings and discussions, and we were laying down the plan. And we decided to approach it like this, the two-row. Rather than two nations, we're two museums going down the river of museum life. And it was all about education. And so as we started this project, we always kept that in mind. And like with Stephanie and the Wild Center, they didn't tell me what to do. And they gave me almost free rein, and I'll get into that a little more later. But with this concept, it kind of grew to not only our museums, but our communities. So our community of Akwesasne, Onondaga, Tuscarora, they come here, they can see relatives, their faces. They can see these exhibits that reflect their culture in a natural history museum. And so this whole project was, took years in the making, but it was very exciting, and I'm always happy to talk about it. But I always keep this in mind about the 2-row, and that's how we approached it. Pass it on to Steph.
Dave.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things when we began to talk about working on a project together, and we began to sort of figure out how we're going to structure it, one of the things that the staff of the Wild Center needed to do was to bring up our self-education and our knowledge about the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations. I am from the South. This isn't where I was born or raised, so there was no chance that I was going to sort of understand all of this from school. And in fact, people that were born and raised here also didn't have that opportunity, I will say. So I know I needed a lot to learn, and it turned out that a lot of the staff, even though they were born and raised here and might have heard a little bit in 4th grade about some of the history, we knew that we were incredibly ignorant about the culture of the Mohawk people, Haudenosaunee, Six Nations, and that we needed to do a little bit of homework before we even started that process. And so we did lots of reading. We did little mini sort of research projects, all of these things to self-educate, so that Dave was with us all along that process, and he mentored us through that process. But there was a lot of that work that we needed to do first, and then Dave helped us continue that education. But it was clear to us from the beginning that we needed to bring our own knowledge up to a certain level before we really could do that partnership in the spirit that Dave has just described. And I have these 3 things up on the screen because these are things as I began to go to conferences and began to work on my own self-knowledge. A couple of things continue to guide me today as we work with partners. So I just want to share them with you. You can always have the best intentions at the beginning of a project and you think you're doing good, but you learn things and then you can do better. And so I love this quote from Maya Angelou, which says, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better." So this, for me, when I have looked back and seen mistakes that I've made, this sort of lets me sort of forgive myself and move forward, because I even knew at that time I probably had the best intentions, but my knowledge wasn't what it needed to be. Nothing about us without us. This was going from conferences that were designed for Native people, museum people, and this was just a refrain that I heard over and over, and so I just keep saying, we're not the storytellers of somebody else's story. So if you start to think that you want to do a partnership or a story or a little bit of information, you need to contact your partners and start that conversation and begin to do that with a partner. So nothing about us without us, and museums we're curators of knowledge, we're the ones who create the story. And so there's a lot of old habits that particularly museums need to break in this realm. And then reciprocity. So again, even in the early days when we were trying to self-educate ourselves, let's get Dave in here every day, because we could all listen to Dave every day. But that wasn't the right spirit of what we were trying to do. We needed to bring our knowledge up. And then every time I ask Dave to do something for the Wild Center, I ask, how is this helping Dave? Is this an equal ask, or am I asking continually to be the one who's asking? And does this have any benefit for Dave and his museum and his goals? So just keeping these 3 things in mind is what keeps me grounded in this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, and you're going to hear about the project because I think that when you get taken through the project, you'll begin to understand how the project evolved, how we all evolved as partners, and how over time it was really a co-created effort. It involved, in the end, even though it was spearheaded by the Wild Center and Dave's organization, at the Six Nations Iroquois Cultural Center, we brought in other partners as we moved along. So you're going to hear a lot from Dave about his organization in just a minute. We also approached the Haudenosaunee Cultural Center Museum to be part of the project. The Native North American Traveling College, which is just over on the over the border on the Canadian side, a wonderful organization that does lots of wonderful work, and particularly a lot of programmatic work, and we partnered with them over time to help us bring those voices to the Wild Center. And the Center for Native People for the Environment that is based out of SUNY ESF. They were our advisors on the project, and they continue to be advisors in a lot of the other work that we're doing here. So what was the purpose? We were funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It was a 4-year timeline, plus, you know, as we were starting to write the grant and as we were waiting to hear for funding, that's the sort of year that we had a lot of intensive self-education and training work on behalf of the entire staff. Then we started the work, 4-year timeline. It had exhibits, programs, events at each partner location. You can see the map here on the right of all the partner locations. We had shared interns for 4 years. These were all Mohawk interns. I guess all but one or two. Yeah, they were. Yeah. Develop. The goal for the Wild Center is we wanted to learn how to develop more culturally responsive interpretation. We use the evaluation process, which would typically be in a museum setting, to gauge the success on the audience. That's not what we did in this case. We use those evaluation dollars to help us understand each other as partners and to actually study the partnership and how it evolved, and also create a really structured feedback loop throughout the process so that we had a lot of good information and continue to iterate and change what our plans were based on the feedback from the partners. And this turned out to be so important. You know, we kind of joked and said they were sort of our project therapist, and they kind of acted in that way, but it was a way for whether it was the partners being interviewed or the interns being interviewed, it was a very neutral party that asked questions, documented the feedback, and then gave feedback back to each one of the partners. So that was super helpful throughout the 4-year relationship. And the project was to design relationships. We had projects, we had exhibits, we had programs, we had very tangible things that came out of that project, but the project was to build the lasting the relationships that we have now. And this took time. This is just reminding our advisors also. There was a series of advisors on the project. There was the Indigenous Education Institute that has worked all over the U.S. To help Native and non-Native museums work together. Again, the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, they were also an advisor on the project. And then Native Pathways was the evaluation firm that specializes in the two principles of that evaluation firm is a Native and a non-Native person. So they specialize in this particular kind of evaluation. And then I'm going to hand it back to Dave to talk about this museum.
Well, this is an image of the museum in Achayota that my grandfather started, and this year will be our 70th season. And it's a modest structure, 4 rooms, and from the outside it's kind of nondescript, but when you walk through those doors, it almost takes your breath away. It's just loaded with artifacts, thousands. Even the floors are painted, different indigenous designs, symbolism, and motifs, all the way up to the peak of the ceiling. It's just full. Too much, almost. And right now, we have plans of expansion. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, that was the first summer in all those years that we didn't open our doors to the public, just like everyone else. That was the first summer in a long time I went hiking, canoeing, and it was a vacation for me. I loved it. But I missed the place, though. It's been there my whole life. But that also gave us time to think about the future. Where are we going from here? Because this museum was just a family organization. My grandfather started it in 1954. And that's my grandfather, and his name was Ray Fadden. His Mohawk name was Haudenosaunee. He also belonged to the Wolf clan. And that's my grandmother, Christine Fadden. Her Mohawk name was Skawanadi, and she belonged to the Turtle clan. My grandfather taught school. He first started at Tuscarora near Niagara Falls. And keep in mind, he was born in 1910, and he lived to be 98 years old. And my grandmother was born in 1912, and she lived to be 102. Good long lives. And you can imagine what they lived through during those years. Even my lifetime, I think about things that have changed. You know, cell phones, even this. You know, it was amazing. The technology and the advancements and the information that's all over the internet. 1910, there was none of that. My grandfather even remembered the first time he saw a plane. Says they let the whole school was let out for the day because it was such an amazing thing to see an airplane. But also, the educational system during that time was awful, racist, about indigenous people. The things that he remembers that he was taught in school was the only good Indian is a dead one. Indians are like little children. They just go on from day to day to day without ever thinking of the future. Then he went home and he thought about it. He goes, well, what about my relatives? You know, all the things that they do. And he disagreed. He fought back. He went to his teacher. He says, that's not true. Because that's not true. That's a lie. He was punished. He was put in a room after school. He had to help out the janitor. And then he must have been really young because he says, if you want to go home, all you have to do is apologize. And he goes, okay, what's that? He didn't know what that word meant. Say you're sorry. He goes, but I'm not sorry. What she said is wrong. He stayed there for 2 months, punished, until finally his grandfather came and straightened things out. That was the beginning. He went on to become an educator, to teach the true history of this country. It isn't pretty. Sometimes you have to tell these bad stories in order to not do it again, or even just to recognize that it did happen. And there's a lot of stories that are painful and angering in a lot of ways. My grandfather lived during a time when attitudes towards indigenous people was kind of at an all-time low. And you can thank people like John Wayne for that. When movies first started coming out, the silent film era, the depictions of indigenous people was actually positive. And a lot of Americans really could sympathize with indigenous people. And it was a very positive outlook. But that turned when John Wayne came around. And attitudes towards indigenous people was at an all-time low. And my grandfather lived during that time, so he could see attitudes, not only within the educational system, but also the country as a whole. 20 years before my grandfather was born was the year 1890. And that was the year there was the massacre at Wounded Knee, where the United States Army camped out around a camp of Lakotas. Men, women, children, families in their teepees out in the Great Plains. And something happened and they opened up their new gun, the Hotchkiss gun, and massacred hundreds of Lakota people. They even chased them down the ravine and shot them in the back. And this isn't a standing army, these are families, men, women, children. Babies were murdered by the United States. After that was done, the most medals of honor ever awarded in this country was during that massacre, 35 for killing innocent people. 20 years later, my grandfather was born. So that just shows you around that time. In fact, my grandfather met a lady who survived that massacre. So in the scope of history and time, it wasn't that long ago that this happened. And when he became an educator, he taught on the reservation, and you could see the native kids really didn't have a sense of who they were. Excuse me. And it was also during this time, there was a policy the United States had towards native people, one of forced assimilation. And there was a man by the name of Pratt who was put in charge of this task that needed to be done. And what he said was kill the Indian and save the man. And how you do that is with the children. You take their kids off the native communities and you put them into boarding schools, scattered across this country, in Canada as well. And if they were dressed in a traditional outfit, they were stripped. They had long hair that was shorn, shaved right off. Those are superficial things. You can change your clothes, your hair will grow back. What was damaging is any time they spoke. If they spoke their own language, they were punished severely. My grandmother was put into one of those schools. And that is partly why I don't speak the language. Because my mother was fluent in Mohawk, and she tried to teach us kids the language. But we stayed with our grandparents a lot. And so we talked to her in Mohawk, but she'd reply in English, because she had that trauma as a child. And it was run by the church. There was a convent. The nuns literally beat the language right out of her. And the rest of her life, she just refused, couldn't do it anymore, couldn't speak. She understood it. That was her first language. It wasn't until the last few weeks of her life the language came back and she forgot English. There was another story of a young girl. She was Seneca, was 6 years old, was brought into this one boarding school, Thomas Indian School out in western New York State. Didn't speak a word of English, nothing. And she's just a little kid. That's what, first grade? And for some reason, they kept dragging her into this closet, thrown in there, no light, no furniture, the door was locked, no window. And she was frightened and scared. And she would cry until she fell asleep, not knowing why she was being punished. They let her out. Next thing she knew, they were dragging her right back in there. Put her in that little room. Tears, confused, didn't understand why. Day after day after day, and weeks, till finally she realized any time she spoke, they'd put her in that room. But she didn't speak English. It was because she was speaking her own language. So she decided she didn't want to go in that room anymore. So she got quiet. For 2 whole years, she didn't utter a word. I don't know if you have any 6-year-old girls in your family. Tell them to be quiet for 1 hour. Imagine days. Imagine weeks, months, 2 years. What does that do to your development as a human? Traumatic. Those are 2 stories out of thousands. Not to mention the deaths that occurred. There were murders. They're now finding unmarked graves at these schools. They're using that underground penetrating radar. In Canada, they found over 10,000 children buried. No marker, no nothing. Families weren't notified. My grandfather didn't go to that school, so he made it his life's work to tell the truth, the history, the culture, the stories, the songs, the ceremonies, to instill that sense of pride in oneself, especially those native kids. He met my grandmother at Niagara Falls, and they moved to Akwesasne, and he taught at the Mohawk School in Hogansburg. And the same thing at Tuscarora. These young Mohawk kids really didn't have a sense of their identity because it wasn't taught, it wasn't promoted. And we're talking about the 1930s, 40s, World War II, around that time. So he established an organization of young people called the Akwesasne Mohawk Counselors Organization. And at first it was boys and girls, about 13, 14 years old. But he soon realized activity they do, they were more interested in each other than learning about any history. So he decided to just teach the boys. And they would travel. He would raise money. It was before grants, and he would just, out of his own pocket, when he had enough money, he'd load up the car full of kids, and they'd hit the road. They'd go to museums. They'd go to historical sites that are significant in our history. They'd visit other Indian reservations. They made it all the way to Oklahoma. They made it to Cahokia Mound out near St. Louis. He said if he had enough money, he would have taken to the pyramids in Mexico, just to show them that your ancestors were here and we had great civilizations, contrary to what is taught in school. But it wasn't allowed to teach that in school, so he had to do it on his own. In fact, it reached a point where his Mohawk kids, his students, he would teach them the culture, the history, but he had to be quiet about it. He couldn't do it out in the open. At one point, he even had to have a kid stand out in the hallway as a lookout for the non-native principal, because it wasn't allowed. If the non-native principal came by, they'd quickly get their books out and look like they're reading or doing math work. But the whole time, he was telling them stories, teaching them the history. But it was underground. It wasn't allowed. But it got better over time, over the years and decades. And they started to paint murals on the walls, not of George Washington or Benjamin Franklin, but of the peacemaker, Aintuata, Jigumsaze, Sitting Bull, the Crazy Horse. Those are our heroes. And they'd paint them on the walls so that those young faces, young people could see their heroes every day. School was let out for the summer. They come back in the fall. The non-native administration would whitewash it, paint over it, cover it up. It wasn't allowed. That didn't stop him. He says, well, I got more paint. And they'd paint another one. Over the years, it just reached a point where, it was a struggle to teach the truth, the history. So finally, somebody was visiting him once, and my grandfather was a collector. He'd always collect items, all sorts of things. And he had a visitor at his house, and he goes, boy, your living room looks like a museum. And that gave him the idea. So in 1954, they started out with a 2-room little building in Anchayota. Those are native students from Akwesasne that came to help build it. Modest structure, filled it right up. And this is where we are today. They added on a room in the front and another room in the back. And like I said in the beginning, we're out of room. And so we're going to expand. In 2020, we became a not-for-profit during the pandemic. And like all creative people, our ideas just bloomed. And so right now, and I didn't bring a slide for this, but we have plans for an expansion that will house this building in a new building. We don't want to take away the atmosphere of what my grandfather did, his work. It's quite impressive. So there'll be a new building around the old building, almost like that will be the heart of a new building. And of course, it'll be all climate controlled, but we're going to try to go net zero, just same philosophy as the Wild Center, to take care of this planet. And one way to do it is to become net zero. So that's our plan, and that's also reflective of our philosophy towards the earth, and you take care of it for future generations. We were able to acquire 300 acres of land, working with the Adirondack Land Trust. That's where we're going to move this building to a new site just down the road, not too far, and have the new facility on 24 acres, but the remainder of the acreage will be protected forever. It'll be under a conservation easement. There'll be trails, and we might have lean-tos and things, but it's almost like we're getting some land back to us. And if you ever get a chance, you go in just as a sampling of some important artifacts. There's some wampum belts. There's a dugout canoe that was found at the bottom of Lake Placid. There was scuba divers were salvaging the old sunken logs from the logging days. You can salvage the inner wood, it's still good. They stumbled on a canoe. Grandfather heard about it, hopped in his truck, raced down there and bought it for $200. But it's been sitting there ever since. And one of my favorite pieces is that pottery bowl right there. And that was found in Silver Lake Mountain. And that's about a 15-minute drive from Achayota, right in the heart of the Adirondacks. And it was a hunter just accidentally found it in this rock shelter. And he was getting out of the rain to get out of the weather, and he went under this rock, and he found this huge, it's big too, it's about that big pottery bowl. Took it home, he didn't know what it was, and then he retired. And he was going to move to Florida. And by then, my grandfather opened a museum, and he stopped by one day, and he says, "Do you want this thing? I don't know what it is." And, "Where'd you find it?" Because my grandfather identified it right away as the collar. It was very distinctively Iroquoian. So they went back to the site, and he found more pieces. It was broken. He put it back together. But for me, that tells me that we've been here a long time. Because pottery is a lost art. When the Europeans came, we started to trade for iron and brass kettles. Pottery kind of just disappeared. So this predates contact with Europeans, and that is just down the road from us. So that's one of the more significant items in our collection. And this is some of my grandfather's work. Excuse me. He did a lot of pictographic writing. These are on the walls. And like I said earlier, floor to ceiling, it's just covered. And a lot of it he did himself. And he was a prolific bead worker. And he used, they call them seed beads. They're little glass beads, they're tiny. And if you get a chance to visit, just to see the amount of work that goes into one beaded belt, it's amazing. We have one beaded belt in the second room that's up on the top, right near the pitch of the ceiling. It goes all the way around the room. It's 75 feet long. And the pictographs, they're not like reading like English. They're just reminders of a story. And you can just follow along, and the storyteller, it just helps with the memory. So that story that goes around the room takes a long time. That story takes about 6 days to tell it by memory. Everything is handwritten, and that's one chart, one that's on the wall in the second room. It's a diagram of our, what they call Guyana Let Go, or the Great Law of Peace, our political structure. And it was all done with India ink and a quill pen. And I don't know if you've ever dabbled in that. I was awful at it, because every time I dipped the ink, it'd be a blot of ink would go like this. Excellent penmanship, and throughout the museum in that collection, it was all done by hand. So he was dedicated. And later on in life, he said if he had a computer when he was a young man, says this museum would be 100 times as big, because he could only do so much. And this room, the second room, is where the magic takes place. You can see those benches off to the side. We pull them out, people have a seat, and that's my dad reciting and telling stories. Myself talking to some young Mohawk kids, telling the story. It's not a big room, and so the most kids we've had in that room was 96. I don't know how that happened, but that was like the only way they could come, and they really wanted to come visit. He says, well, it's going to be tight quarters, and sure enough, I was in a corner, and there was kids right at my feet, all the way spilled into the other rooms, but we pulled it off. But that was about 100 kids. But this is a typical size, 40, 50 kids we get. And it's our opportunity to teach. And we teach through storytelling, sharing our culture, like I'm sharing with you right now. And I hope to reach as many people as I can. And throughout the years, I don't know, we've reached thousands, over the years. But this is where the magic takes place. And I'm also an artist. I'm a painter. I've illustrated over 50 books in my career. What I really want to do is just paint. But I have to do this other museum stuff. But but that's my passion, is painting and artwork. And one of my missions through art is to depict indigenous people as humans. There's a lot of native imagery throughout American culture, throughout time. They're all stoic, serious. And I think what that's from is that old-time photography. You had to sit still for a minute or whatever, so you can't hold a smile for a minute. So you just keep a straight face. And so a lot of artists would use those images as reference, and they're all serious. And so a lot of people that view these images think, oh, they're all serious and they're all mean. And that's also reflective of the narrative they teach at school in popular culture, that the savage, the warlike, and all these negative terminology about our people. It's not real. It's not what I've witnessed in my life. There's laughter, excellent sense of humor among most families. We like to pick and tease each other. Jokes, stories, songs, dances. We're humans. We cry. We feel pain. We're all those things like all of us. But for some reason, the psyche of the American public has this romanticized image of indigenous people as the guy looking off into the sunset, watching the buffalo. It's just romantic. But reality, we're just like everyone else. Maybe we speak a different language, we have different customs and ways. And that really hit home to me a couple of years ago, as I met a family from Afghanistan. And right away, everybody's like, oh, Afghanistan, you think of the Taliban and war, and all the imagery that we see on the news is negative. I met the guy, we hit it off. We have so much in common that I didn't hear on the news. How they welcome guests and visitors, and it's customary. Their customs are very similar to ours. We have our differences, of course, but we focused on those things that are the same. And we got along very well. And it dawned on me that I had a negative image of Afghanistan because of the news and the wars. It was my own fault because I didn't look into it. But it wasn't until I met that family that I really got a true understanding of those people. So that's what I try to do with my art, is to show our identity. Now I'm going to whip through this. I don't know how much time I have. I will.
Keep going, but we do.
Okay, yeah. But anyways, when this project occurred, I have to thank Steph for this. I remember the day we were walking around the exhibits, and it's, again, a beautiful place, and she's like, well, pick a spot. I really? I figured I'd get some little obscure corner where nobody would see it, and no, anywhere. And I really like that pond, and I think everyone does. And it's the Marsh Oxbow, and it's just nice. There's fish and there's turtles, and right there. And I said, what about here? She said, sure. Really? I was surprised, really. And I was okay. And so a challenge is what? What are we going to do? And so I'm thinking from an indigenous perspective, and what popped in my head right away was, in our language, they say, Ohando Galiwadekwa. And what that means is the words that come before all else. At any gathering of our people, any event, whether it be spiritual, political, weddings, funerals, there's certain words they say at the beginning and also at the end. And all it is it's an address, an expression of gratitude towards every part of creation, the natural world. And I thought that was fitting because of the philosophy of the Wild Center. With all the work that they do is to disseminate an appreciation of the earth, a respect of the animals, the trees, everything, to enjoy it, to experience it. But in our way is we do it with words. We talk to each element, every part of creation, from the smallest plant to the fish, to the turtles, to the water, the streams, the ponds, the lakes, all the way up to the trees, the animals, the birds, even the wind. Even last night, I heard in the middle of the night, woke me up, Latiwelas, my grandfathers, the thunder, woke me right up, powerful. We talked to them. If you don't hear them anymore, something's wrong. Something's out of whack, and it's dangerous. The sky, the air, the sun, the moon, even the stars, all of those things, it takes time because you got to talk to every one of them and say thank you as a collective voice. And so right away I thought, that's perfect. And so the challenge for me was, okay, how do I do it here? And when you looked around, I looked and there was kind of an industrial look in the ceiling. You know, there was ductwork and fans and hard, right angles and corners and edges, and that doesn't reflect the natural world. Everything is, has a roundish shape to it, soft in a way. So how am I going to reinterpret this space? And so as an artist, I got to work. That was the primary first sketch I did, was that space. Was how am I going to include every aspect of creation in this space? I was all set. We had the water already. We had the fish, turtles, ducks were there. They were already there, so I didn't have to worry about creating imagery to represent those things. So what I had to do was work my way up, just like you do outside. You work your way up to the stars and the moon. How am I going to do this? And so these sketches, these rough ideas, and we had meetings back and forth. There's another concept. And I also wanted a space that was all-encompassing, all around you. So you look up and you even look behind you. And that was looking straight up. And if you notice the design at the top, that's one of a basket. And I wanted to have a basket behind. And the symbolism behind that is, there's a little science to it too, but the basket is among our people. Not only does it hold things like food or your items, symbolically they say that's where our names are. Like when I die, my name, Kanietakeron, will go back into that basket, meaning somebody else can use it. But you have to wait a year after I pass away. And then there's a new baby born, maybe during the same circumstance. They can take that name. The women hold that basket, and all of the names of the future are in there. So that's a symbol of how we look at our lives and what we do in our lives, is that we keep in mind 7 generations into the future. What do we do today as humans walking this earth? How does it affect those faces that haven't come up yet? Is it going to help them or is it going to harm them? So we have to be very careful how we tread on this earth. And we did a lot of damage without knowing it, and maybe you did know it. But now there's a shift, with thanks to the folks at the Wild Center and other organizations. We're thinking of the future. And so it fit, this exhibit. And so that was the symbolism of the basket. And another thing about the basket is made from the black ash split. And if you've ever heard of the black ash borer, the invasive bug that's killing off the black ash, that's how we make our baskets. And so that might be something that disappears. We don't know yet. And then as an artist, I kind of went wild and coming up with all these creative things. And I'm just going to go through these really quick, just to show you the process from an artist and an exhibit designer. Because I wanted to keep in mind the underlying theme of the Thanksgiving address, to try to include everything. It started to come together. And it was the team at the Wild Center we met, and how do we accomplish this? And I could come up with all kinds of ideas about how do we actually do it. And even there was these giant cement pillars. I don't know if there's any here. They're big, part of the infrastructure. And I said, wow, we got to get rid of those somehow. I think it was Peter had the ideas. We could wrap it with bark. It's not real bark. It's, I think, rubber. And so we got right on it and found a company and got a sample, and it was really a great experience working here. Just the teamwork, the ideas would flow. There's no, I've worked in other places where you get a certain hierarchy and criticisms, and you kind of, rub each other the wrong way. But here, smooth. It was great. And then it started to pick up. And these are all computer renderings. just my ideas and trying to figure out what it's going to look like. Started coming together, but then I had to figure out the exact dimensions of that space. That's where it got complicated. I did sample imagery of that space just to get an idea. I remember once I brought one painting, and they were little, it wasn't these huge things. And we was like, how's this good? We're trying to hold it up. And I remember we set up these chairs and put that painting like a ceiling because I wanted it above us. And I remember, where's Steph? Look over, she's on the floor looking up at it. But that's how you get that perspective, how it's going to look. And then there's the basket area. We had the idea of a kiosk with storytelling. Then I got ambitious. I says, how about you're looking into a basket? That's like you're looking down in this one space, and I had to figure out the walls. But as I got going on it, I actually did a painting of it, got it ready. It's like a puzzle. It's like, and how do you get those angles to look exactly right with all these other angles? I'm not good at math, so so we had to scrap that idea. And then we just came up with a simple design work. And again, this is a computer rendering. And I picked this design. It's a design that they usually use beadwork or even porcupine quill work, embroidery. And the idea is you see the mountains and the sun rising. It's a symbol of these mountains. In the scroll-like shape on the bottom that symbolizes water. And that's another one of the trees and the mountains and the water. So that was the one design I picked. And then it really started to take form, this idea. And again, this is a rendering, computer graphics. And it was like, this is going to look cool. So I had this image, and I'm like, I was nervous because I didn't know if we could accomplish it the way I thought it should look. There's another different tones that we picked. That was the ceiling. That's one of the final images of what the ceiling was going to look like. And then the work began. I think it was in April. The museum was closed, and their crew got right to work and built the infrastructure to hold this new ceiling. And they actually covered up the pond with a platform. It was like a stage, and I think some of the fish were removed, and the ducks, of course, so they could get access to the ceiling. And we contracted with a company out of New York City called New York Ceiling, and we had meetings with them, and they do very large format printing. It's on a material such that air can flow through, so it's not like too heavy, and it's very light. But I remember I was home, and I got this text from Jen Kretzer, who works here. She works with the Youth Climate. You got to get over here. The guys are here. And she sent me this picture. And this was out in the Great Hall. It was just laid out flat, and it's huge. So I raced down here. I didn't get any speeding tickets. Got here. And I got to take some pictures of before it went up. And they had it all laid out, and I was impressed. The quality was great, perfect. Another one. And then they had to attach it to the infrastructure, and this is where I was biting my nails, because I didn't know if it was going to line up, because one little miscalculation could throw the whole image off, and they were in pieces. So I didn't really want to watch, but I did. They're starting to put it together. That first section, when they got it taut, I was like, this is going to be cool. And they started to put the basket imagery up. And it was all up, and there's the crew, and we took a photo. Then I had to paint certain parts of it between the windows. I had to actually physically paint. And meanwhile, the clock is ticking. And we had an opening in May, I think it was the end of May. And we weren't done, but we had to crank. And I did some images of the animals, the trees, and there was a local company that was hired to do the actual printing. They actually closed their shop because we had so much work, and they did the work, and they delivered it. And that is the actual finished exhibit. When they hung that eagle, I just about cried because he's hanging, you know, it's not like flat on the wall, he's hanging down. There's a before, that's what it looked like, it was beautiful. There's after, a little different. Another angle before, you can see the ductwork and the lights. There's after. There's the entranceway. And one of the things that surprised us, that came out towards, as we were working on this project and these ideas, and you know, I was more focused on the exhibit design, and you know, Steph and their crew were more focused on, you know, educating, talking to their staff, and you know, it was a lot of work. And during one of the meetings, an idea popped up about having interns from our communities. I was like, okay, sounds like a good idea. That was the best decision we made, I think. We were able to hire interns from Haudenosaunee who would work at the Wild Center, they'd work at our place in Achayota, and also the Haudenosaunee Cultural Center. And that's Lorna Mae Thomas. She started there, and she's still working for me. And she's right now at an internship out in New Mexico, due to come back next month, and she's going to work for me full time. And one of those things that probably would have never happened if it wasn't for this project. And that's why this project is so important, not just physically, from a museum exhibit standpoint, it's relationships with people, communities, young people. And so that's one of the best things that came out of this whole project. And there's another intern, Jackie Hall. Oops. And with that, I'll pass it back on to Steph.
Dave.
You're welcome.
So to get back to the project, a little more details, just so you can sort of understand how the Wild Center evolved and through this partnership over time. That once we started, it was really great that we had this exhibit project to work on together, because it was, you know, it's like project learning. We were working beside each other. But immediately after starting working together, new ideas started just bubbling up immediately. So a year after we opened the Oxbow Ways of Knowing exhibition, we had already started to create a new idea. And Dave and two of the interns curated an art exhibition for us from artists from the Haudenosaunee community, and that was up for a year and a half. You can see Dave interpreting one of his paintings for the public. And then it's a lot of those projects that were started during and were, you know, wonderfully funded by the IMLS project are continuing to this day. So we have each summer we support the Center for Native People and the Environment to bring up a group of students, also with some young people from the Haudenosaunee community, and they work with these young people to teach traditional skills, and we support that by coming to the Wild Center and helping with some other logistics. So that one continues. I'm happy to say Dave Fadden is now on our board of trustees, which is a wonderful outcome of our relationship. We continue to work on our permanent exhibits, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, where you can find them out on our floor through this process and our understanding and continued partnership. And I'll point those out as you sort of are leaving, so you can go seek them out. And I just want to get back to a little bit of what Dave talked about with the intern structure. So you know how it is with grants, you sort of have things kind of half-baked. You put in the grant, you get the money, and then the reality sets in. And so one of the things that we learned as the non-native partner is how much we had structured that initial sort of intern idea on things that had previously worked for us, but was not working for this partnership. So very early in the process, we had to completely scrap every assumption that we had and every idea that we had about how that was going to be structured, and we started all over with our partners, and we together created what was going to work for the partners through this process. And so you're seeing some interns here, and several of these interns, why we had sort of in our way of doing things, we have a new interns every year, fellows, interns, that we sort of new people have an opportunity every year. And what happened in this particular case, it was a long-term relationship with a fewer number of individuals, but they stayed with us for a longer period of time. We still touched a lot of people over the life of the 4-year project, but there were a core set of interns that worked with us year after year, and they began to work, because they had developed their skill sets, they began to work more with Dave's Museum in the summer and also the Cultural Center. And instead of sort of dividing up, or initially we had thought they were going to sort of Tuesday here, Wednesday here, Thursday here, this kind of crazy idea. We completely scrapped all that, and there was a concentration at the Wild Center in year 1, and then a concentration at the Cultural Center, because they were doing major renovations at that time, and that's what our partners needed. And then the last year, they worked at Dave's Museum. So I guess it's really a story about what true co-creation means. And it was an idea that sort of came in at the last minute, so we didn't have time to do that real deep co-creation of how this would work. And we luckily were able to sort of scrap it all and start all over. IMLS is a wonderful funder, and they want you to learn through a process, and so that's what we did. So from a non-native perspective, when we start a new project, we ask ourselves, do we understand the Indigenous perspective about this particular topic that we're working on? And then how might we invite and include these voices into our work? And so when you go into the Solutions exhibition, which I hope you'll visit while you're here today, it's in the center of our exhibit hall. You will find several places where we were able to include Indigenous voices within that context of climate solutions. We have an artist, a seed saving bowl from Kanietakeron Fox. We worked with artists who were also filmmakers, and those films were in the exhibition. And then Dave, we commissioned Dave to work on a painting for us, and we'll hear about that in just a second. Some other things that have lived on past the project and are sort of here as part of the Wild Center, we always have a Three Sisters garden on our site. And then on the left, you're going to see our animal care curatorial staff learned of this project organized by the Comanche Nation, in which we have a lot of live animals that are nationally and federally protected. And the feathers of those birds are also protected. And so you can't possess, we cannot possess, you cannot possess those feathers either. And so what we did is we collected those feathers, we cleaned them, we cataloged and organized them, and then we worked through this feather repository to give them back to Indigenous people for ceremony and personal use. And we have given back over 6,000 feathers to date through this project. So this is an ongoing project. Just a couple of other exhibitions. And one thing, I don't know that it, I was trying to sort of talk about things that may have impact on all of your work, but what's important at the exhibit level, and it may be important for your type of work, is when you're in a museum and you're reading a label, the voice is from that organization. Right? You're reading a label, it's the voice of that organization. So what happens when you start to work with partners and you're bringing in other voices? It's really important from an exhibit perspective to figure out and to work within that sort of medium of exhibits to make sure that the audience knows who's speaking to you at that time. And so the way that we do it in the exhibit world is you use a lot of quotes, you use a lot of video. I, in particular, use a lot of imagery so that you know when you're at that particular part of that exhibit who is talking to you. Again, and then another thing that you will see, it's very subtle, but it's there in places where we have worked with other voices, is we have kind of an authorship panel which describes who worked on the exhibit. I always like to have an image of that person and their bio and a quote or something like that. So this is just a very nuanced kind of exhibit thing, and we're still trying to figure out the best way to do this, but this is what we're doing at this moment. And before I get to this, I'll just say, so there is Dave's exhibit, which you've heard a lot about. Before you reach Dave's exhibit and the lean-to, we just have, with partners, have reinterpreted that exhibit. We had some incorrect information in there, and we worked with Robin Kimmerer and Neil Patterson and people from the Center for Native People to reinterpret the story of maple from an indigenous perspective, and there's an indigenous and science perspective. So we have redone that exhibit. Around the corner, when you go right past the otters, you will see exhibit that Marla, that was one of our interns, has created. She's an archaeologist. And then inside Dave's exhibition is also a basket exhibit done by May, which she has, that he introduced to you. So those are all sort of around from us. And then Dave, why don't you talk about, when you leave, you will see this painting out there, and it's an interactive painting. I'm going to let Dave tell you a little bit about it, and then we're going to have Q&A for what little time is left. So, go ahead.
Well, as a painter, like I said earlier, I always try to depict indigenous people with different expressions and smiling, so on and so forth, and a lot of figure painting and portraiture. And a number of years ago, I was not tired of it. I wanted to try new things, and so I started a style that was almost like pointillism, just like dabs of paint in different colors to create an image. And the first one I did, it was monochromatic, and it looked pretty neat. It was very interesting. But I went a step further, and I added a little more color. And then every dab of paint comprised this mosaic. I would take a different color with a liner brush and paint around it, like outline it, every dab of paint. Then within each dab of paint, I'd take another brush and paint a design within it. Mostly Iroquoian, or some of it means nothing. But in the end, it's kind of impressive. It's a mosaic style of technique. And the first one I did, I sold it right away. So I was like, oh, I'm onto something here. And so the only trouble is that they take a long time. And they're about 5 feet by 5 feet, they're pretty big. And to do one painting takes roughly 4 months, something more or less, if I just do that alone, focus on it. And so that was a style that I really enjoyed. And even some of my paintings, and every one of them, my originals, I include Star Wars imagery, just sense of humor. And I like Star Wars too. But anyways, when the climate solution exhibit was coming up, Stephanie and I, we talked, and the idea to have one of my paintings with the climate solutions, and so I figured that maybe a mosaic style painting would be interesting. And again, our ideas is once you start, it keeps rolling. And the idea was to do a mosaic style painting without filling in every paint dab like I do on my originals. But to do that and make reproductions, high quality reproductions, stretch them on a bar, and invite the audience, the visitors, to take paint pens and to fill in their own mosaic. It can be anything, but we try to ask them to, what would you miss if this climate changes drastically? What are the things you love about this place? And it can be whatever. And so from time to time, they bring it out into the Great Hall and invite people to add their own 2 cents to the climate solution. And the image I picked was of it just popped in my head, was of a young girl releasing a bird. I don't think you see it on this, but you'll see it on the one outside. But the idea was that, I don't know about you, but if I see some animal that's injured, and I love animals, I want to help it. I want to nurture it, take care of it, whether it be a bird or a chipmunk. And throughout my life, my grandfather and my parents would rescue injured animals and nurture them until they could release. And even my grandfather, back in the day, he used to have a red-tailed hawk and a sharp-shinned hawk that he built this elaborate structure to house it. It could no longer fly. Somebody shot it. Why would you shoot a hawk? But anyways, it could never fly again, but he took care of it until it died. This was before you needed a license. And he just did it on his own, or maybe you did need a license, he did it anyway. But he had a way with the animals, and so I took that to heart. I saw it my whole life, and so if you see an injured animal, you want to let it go, release it, healthy. And it's also like the earth. The earth is overheating. And it's the earth in our terminology is our mom. It's our mother. And if your mother's sick, you don't just walk away. You try to take care of her, nurture her, bring her back to health. That's your mom. So the idea was that with climate solutions is like how you take an injured animal, you nurture it, take care of it, feed it until it's healthy, and then you re-release it back where it belongs. So if you have the chance, I think you have everything set up out there. Add your own 2 cents to this mosaic. And there's another copy that's actually in the exhibit space. That in the end, when this is all filled in, it's not there yet. I just looked at it, got a ways to go. They'll replace the one in the main exhibit with the one that everyone participated in.